And so I'm going to shift over to our, second one. Our second example or this emerging work is really our red flag score. So we've actually been doing this for quite some time on a separate, in another silo. I mean, this data is all about silos, but the opportunity came about recently for we have an internal auditing department that does risk management auditing within the agency across all of our childcare programs. So the opportunity came up we already were integrating and using the same data that they were using to do red flag risk scores. And so their contract was expiring. So we were able to, put in place a structure to bring them into the CUSP platform and actually use the CUSP platform to build out their red flag scoring process. It was time for them to revamp that process anyway, and then they had the contract expiring, so it was the timing was really perfect for that. So within the data we have, what we're going to do is actually develop metrics and thresholds to help us suggest potentially non-compliant behavior that can take place. Not necessarily to be punitive, but just to be to understand what risk exists in the system, and how do we go about uncovering that risk, and and then help us understand how to target our investigations more appropriately so that they can be more effective and impactful. But also, once again, to create a feedback loop that allows us to put in place better policies and procedures and business rules to help reduce fraud. And so what we're going to do here is I'm going to walk you through a couple of the metric examples, which are priority payments and then family distance to provider. Carl, go to the next slide. Okay, so the first example here is our first risk score is our percent of payment requests that are high priority and that are billed above the maximum rate. So in Georgia, we have two priority groups in our subsidy program where we pay the full provider rate no matter what, and those are children in our foster care and then children with disabilities. And so what we look at here is, are there concentrations, meaning are there providers who are billing a high number of those scholarships? And to figure out if there's a reason for that. We found over time that is a risk factor for fraud. And so this is kind of the metric that we would use to help uncover that a little bit. And so what you can see here is, the blue line represents the threshold at which that the 10th percentile, the highest percentile, I believe, is here. And it lets us know by, the number of distinct children within the payment. And so we have, and some of the highest ones you see here are actually smaller providers. And so I know based on the data that, well, those are probably family providers. And so obviously if you have maybe 1 to 5 kids, just having a couple could mean you're high on this list. And we actually have a few family providers that are focused specifically on either children with disabilities or children with foster care. But as you go up in the number of children, then you realize that that's really larger providers. And so that would focus your efforts as an agency and say, okay, well, this would give you, a particular score that might go into a composite score. Carl, go to the next slide. And then another one we found is, highly correlated with fraud is family distance travel to providers. I can't speak to other states, but I mean, one thing we found is that in our subsidy program specifically, we have had issues over time of providers essentially having families on their subsidy rolls that don't live near them, and they've essentially billing because they can and because they have access to that family's record, and they don't live anywhere near them. So we found that if we look at outliers within distance traveled, so we can obviously have provider data, we have family data, we see family address to the provider address, and then run the analysis and come out with the scoring, and that allows us to understand to what degree families are traveling to providers, which also is a fantastic stat anyway. But also if you see that they're traveling extensively for care, that can also be a risk factor, and that also goes in that scoring metric.